Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Green Earth Podcast by DGB Group. In today's episode, we're joined by Rich Gilmore from Carbon Partners. It was a very productive conversation in which we explored many topics, but most importantly, we discussed the current outlook of global climate action and how we can scale sustainability. But before we begin, I'd like to remind you that the Green Earth Podcast is a DGB Group initiative. DGB is a large-scale nature-based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. But now, with no further ado, here's my conversation with Rich Gilmore. Well, Rich, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Before we begin, would you care to introduce yourself to the audience? Let us know about what you do and about your company.
Sure. Thanks, Pedro, and thanks for having me on the pod. I'm the CEO of Carbon Growth Partners, and we are a specialist investment manager in global carbon markets. It's all we do. We wake up every day, we eat, drink, dream, sleep, think about carbon markets all day and how to make them work best for not only for investors who invest with us, but also for people in nature. And I'm coming to this with a sort of background that really only makes sense if you're doing this. They look like a series of random right or left turns, but I was a derivatives trader for about first 8 years of my career, then worked in the circular economy and worked in blue carbon projects for a long time, and then worked in social enterprise development in least developed countries in Asia. And then finally, before establishing Carbon Growth Partners, worked for the Nature Conservancy in the Asia Pacific region. So all of those things, community development, financial management, conservation and science are all very helpful when you're deploying capital into the carbon markets.
Amazing, Rich. That's really interesting. And what got you interested in this particular market? How did you get into the carbon market?
It was completely by accident, Pedro. I had what was literally a life-changing experience. So 20 years ago, I was working for one of the world's largest packaging companies, and they sent me as part of my leadership development to go and volunteer on a mangrove project, of all things, in Kenya.
Oh, wow.
I had no interest in mangroves, really no interest in climate at that time. And I spent a couple of weeks in the mud in Kenya on what would today be called a blue carbon project, and then was just called a mangrove project. And I was completely inspired by the idea that capable people who are super intelligent, super articulate, would choose to spend their time in the mud solving other people's problems. I thought that is a pretty great way to spend someone's time. So I quit my job. I went and got an environmental management degree, and then I became the CEO of Earthwatch, the organization that I'd volunteered with. That was almost 20 years ago, and the rest is history, as they say.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. It's almost one of that, similar to that Japanese saying of the world is going to get better when people start planting trees, which they will won't enjoy the shade of, or something like that.
Yeah. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is now. And I feel a little bit that way about climate action. We can bemoan how long it's taken us to take action and how behind we are. The other thing we can do is just start. Just be positive and get going.
Absolutely. And on that note, that's actually something that I would like to ask you about. How late are we when it comes to taking action?
We're pretty late. I mean, we've known about this since the 1860s. So the greenhouse effect was proven experimentally more than 150 years ago. And, we've known the root causes of that, for almost as long. If you think about how long we have left or how late we are, maybe it's helpful to think about in terms of not just annual emissions or reductions, but the annual carbon budget that we have left. It's only about it's less than that now. It's about 300 billion tons of emissions. It's about 6 years worth of emissions. And so it's likely that we would exceed that carbon budget, and that's when the role of removals, has to come in. To put it another way, to stay on track for between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, we have to reduce emissions by about 12 million tons every day if we start today. Unfortunately, we're not going to start today. Emissions haven't peaked. And so that means tomorrow we have to do 24 million tons, and the next day 36, and the day after that 48. So we still have time, but the longer we leave it, the more we have to do and the more expensive it gets.
That makes a lot of sense. And this is, at one point, it's a little bit, well, it's hopeful because, as you said, we still got time. But on the other hand, it seems like a massive undertaking, and it seems like it's something that's also a little bit out of our control, right? So, how difficult and how possible it would be for us to really do that, to make that happen?
I mean, it's not, it's all completely in our control. This is just physics and chemistry and mathematics. We know that if we put a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and other gases, it's going to warm the planet by a known amount. And we have the technological solutions and we have the money. It's actually not that expensive to solve. If you think that global GDP is what, 100 and something trillion dollars a year, you can solve climate change for 5 trillion of that. So I would say it's a little bit frustrating that we know what the deal is. We know that we get to spend, if we spend 5% of our income solving this existential problem, we get to keep 95% of our income and all of our health and all of our species and all of our clean, water and nature. That seems like an extremely good deal to me. It's just that some of our political and corporate incentives are wrong. So we incentivize, politicians to behave on 3 or 4 year cycles, and we incentivize CEOs and boards to perform on sometimes annual performance cycles. And so we're trading off those short-term things for something that we know we have to do in the medium to longer term. And if we knew how to overcome that sort of, behavioral psychology problem where people know the right thing to do and they know how to do it but aren't doing it, if we knew how to solve that, climate change would be fixed by now. So I don't have a silver bullet on that. But I think there's something that we dismiss a bit or overlook when we talk about, we're reluctant to talk about the role of voluntary markets. I think there is an overlooked role for corporate CEOs just to do the right thing, just because it's the right thing to do. We shouldn't, I think only doing something because it's required of you by law is an extremely low bar. And I think it's reasonable of us to expect more from our corporate and business and political leaders.
Is it though? Because I mean, I may be a little bit too cynical, but whenever I think of incentives and the way that people behave, it's usually not because it's just the right thing to do. There are other incentives behind their behavior, and I think one of the most interesting parts of marketing is getting people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. That's something that usually happens a lot, and usually getting people to do even whatever the wrong thing or whatever thing for the right reasons. I mean, is not really a very effective incentive in my view. Does that make any sense, or am I just being too
Yeah,
pessimistic?
it does. But it does, but I hope you're wrong,
Me too.
because if we're only going to do, even if you look at, globally regulated markets, if you look at the number of carbon markets globally or emissions pricing schemes that include some form of offsetting or carbon abatement certificates or carbon credits, it's about 50% of global emissions and 50% of GDP, a bit more than that now actually, for countries that have announced that they will allow carbon credit markets or those sorts of instruments or have plans to do so. But it's not 50, that's 50% of global emissions emitted by those countries. But obviously the scope of those schemes is not 100% of their emissions. And so think about the counterfactual that we are just going to, force incentives on people. You got to do two things. You got to think, well, how many emissions is that? And so let's say, it's maybe 20% of global emissions. At best, you're solving 20% of the problem when we know that every single unabated ton of CO2 now is making a climate that is already in crisis worse. So every single emitted ton needs to be abated starting now. And so even if you do legislate, you don't cover all emissions. And just think about the political likelihood of getting globally consistent, universal, and punitive carbon pricing that motivates those companies to take that action or countries to take that action. So I absolutely agree with it's a critical role of regulation and forced incentives, but on its own, that's not going to get us there. And so people refer to, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, by definition, is a voluntary mechanism. That's its purpose. It's there to enable voluntary cooperation. And so, yes, completely get your point on how people are, on the behavioral norms of people and how they're motivated, but regulation alone is not going to get us there.
I can completely agree with you on that one, especially if we're talking about punitive regulation. I think, in fact, this is one of the reasons that so many people turn away from sustainable action because of the famous carbon tax way of thinking. It's just another tax for me to pay. Is just another way of making
Yeah.
things more expensive, and life is already pretty difficult for most of the people. Um, it's just one more thing that they have to worry about. My thinking behind finding other motivation besides just being the right thing to do is more geared towards finding actual incentives in the not just the carbon market, but sustainable action as a whole. What could
Mm.
possibly be that would make people interested in this, besides just being the right thing to do?
Oh, it's a good question. I think if we all knew the answer to that, we would be done by now. But you're right. You can replace carrots with sticks and have the same effect. Rather than imposing a carbon tax on someone who doesn't do something, you can impose tax relief on someone who does. You've then got a problem solved for the revenue base if you're providing a tax incentive. There's also something about. I mean, I think that in large part maybe the price premium for sustainable products has dissipated or has shrunk when there's inflation and cost of living. Certainly, I would say the liquidity premium hasn't. So even if your product doesn't sell for more, if it's carbon neutral or responsible or sustainable, it should sell first. And so you do get a liquidity premium. I don't think that's gone away. But ultimately, I think, there's a couple of levers. There is, for better or worse, we're a consumption-driven global economy. And so motivating consumers to choose not only the cheapest product, but a cost-effective product that is responsible. And then those sort of on the carrot side, then on the stick side, what is the regulation that we need to impose globally? The fair price of carbon emissions, at least according to the Biden administration, is something like $160 a ton. That's the social impact of emitting a ton of CO2, and the social impact of emitting a ton of methane is 10 times that. And so if you're able to abate your emissions for anything less, or pay a tax for anything less than $160 a ton, you should be in front. Now, we're not going to have $160 a ton global punitive universal carbon price anytime soon. But there is a sort of an arbitrage there. If you are a responsible company and you do believe that climate action is going to become or be a behavioral norm, then there should be an incentive on price to act quickly. You just got to believe that.
That is definitely one way of looking at things. And so today with your company, you help other companies, diminish their emissions and compensate for those that cannot be avoided, right? What kind of companies are seeking your help, and what are their motivations?
Yeah. Yeah, we're not advising companies on how to reduce, their emissions. We're not sustainability consultants. We invest in portfolios of projects that help to abate that last mile of emissions. And so we're not in the sustainability consulting business, and we don't expect that emissions offsetting carbon markets should be the primary tool for decarbonisation. We've got to reduce emissions within our supply chains, but crucially, we have to, offset what's left. And I think the mitigation hierarchy is upside down. So the precautionary principle rather than say take the SBTI approach, the Science-Based Targets Initiative approach, it says do your best and then 30 years from now offset what's left over. That's leaving a lot to chance. We should be offsetting everything now, and then as you successfully reduce your emissions over time, you've got a less and less, smaller and smaller offset obligation every year because you've successfully decarbonized your supply chain. But the precautionary principle says start offsetting now and do less over time, as opposed to waiting now and then doing more over time later. The time value of carbon says you have to do it the other way around. In terms of what the companies are looking for to offset their emissions, I've been actually surprised about a sort of trend that's emerged or re-emerged in the last couple of months. As you know, one of the big topics of conversation in the carbon market is the convergence of compliance markets and voluntary markets. So carbon credits that are originated within the VCM architecture and then are usable in markets like CORSIA or domestic or regional carbon pricing schemes. And so you would expect more of the interesting capital to be going to those types of projects. We've been really interested by an emergence or re-emergence of interest just in pure voluntary high quality nature projects and companies sticking to their nature-based offsetting commitments and looking to invest upstream in projects that can help them deliver that sustainable, reliable, high quality supply of offsets going forward. That's particularly true because a bunch of companies have commitments starting on or around 2030. And if you start a nature restoration project now, it's probably around 2030 when that project starts delivering any volume at scale. So a number of companies are looking to the future, looking to their 2030 and beyond targets and saying, I need to start investing now to have that sustainable supply in 5 years, which is different to what we saw, previously, which was where companies just felt comfortable, being in the spot market and buying and retiring their carbon credits when they need them. The market is either oversupplied or undersupplied for credits, depending on your frame of reference. But I think a number of companies have decided that it's undersupplied for high quality nature credits in particular, but not only restoration credits. And so we're seeing more demand than we were expecting actually for those sort of projects, alongside that demand for CORSIA and other compliance eligible credit types.
But these companies that are on the voluntary side of things, what are their motivations? Why are they interested in that?
A good question. I asked one of them that very question on the weekend. And the answer was when they made the commitment 3 or 4 years ago, it was largely because their peers had done so, or that was because their sector was moving in that direction, or the world was moving in that direction, global policy was moving in that direction, and they haven't been given a reason to stop. So they're meeting those commitments. And I think that's true of the carbon market overall. I think there's a perception that the carbon market has shrunk or is imperiled. Actually, the carbon market is growing. It grew. It was set a record last year for carbon offset use, and it's continuing to grow. It's just growing off a low base in volume. So there's thousands of companies who offset their emissions every year, but that number needs to grow substantially. So I think at the time there are a number of social, economic factors that may not be as strong as they were now, but there are fewer companies than you would expect or that is perceived that are backsliding on their commitments. I think what's happened instead is, in the past couple of years, if a company hasn't already made or activated their commitment, they've kind of been given implicit permission to wait and see. But by and large, those companies who have made and activated a commitment are staying the course.
That is very interesting. So they made a commitment because they thought that's just the direction that the world is going, and they just did not have a reason to stop.
Yeah, I mean, look at if you've gone and got your CEO, bonus approved, your board re-elected, you've raised money, you've sold a product on the basis that your company is taking certain climate action or is selling a carbon neutral product, and even if you did so, voluntarily, I think for a lot of companies, even though that they did it without being required to do so by law, doesn't mean it's a voluntary commitment. Like they've made undertakings to stakeholders and feel compelled to continue to meet those obligations. That's not true of every company. But by and large, what we're seeing is companies staying the course, and now we need more companies, to join the fray.
That's very interesting. So this would be a case of actually marketing being one of the reasons that companies, and not necessarily just marketing towards the B2C marketing, but actually internal marketing with stakeholders, maybe collaborators from these companies. These commitments are important, and it makes sense. Like if I think about my generation, most of the people that I know are interested in working in something that has a purpose, in not just companies that pay well, but companies that are good for society and their peers and the industry overall. And that's definitely one of the reasons, one of the things that can tick the needle to the end of, oh yeah, this is a company that I want to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you think about the distribution of companies as a bell curve, there are a bunch of companies right up the most responsible end of climate action. Look at the Symbiosis Coalition in the US, for example, companies like Google and Meta and Salesforce, who have already made net zero commitments and are already meeting those commitments using high quality nature-based projects alongside their internal decarbonisation programs. We don't need to focus on them. And then there's a whole bunch of companies down the other end of the bell curve, the tail end, who are just never going to take action. Not interested, not responsible, just focused on short-term gain. I'd say there's fewer listed companies that are able to say they don't care about climate or sustainability. Where we need to be focused is the middle of the bell curve, where 80% of companies and 80% of emissions are, and just move those companies, slightly along that emissions reduction curve and responsibility curve. And as you said, that's going to be partly driven by their ability to attract and retain a younger workforce, an AI literate workforce. And so, yes, absolutely. But I was also, going the other way, and sort of the reasons why companies who haven't yet started have been given permission to wait. I was chatting to the CEO of a listed gold company recently, and he said 3 or 4 years ago, the number one thing that my shareholders wanted to ask me about was net zero. That would be the opening conversation for maybe 85, 90% of shareholder discussions. Maybe now it's third or fourth, because you've got, global policy, what's going on in the US, tariffs and trade, still residual inflation, geopolitical unrest that have sort of been elevated over the past couple of years. So that doesn't mean that they're not committed to climate change. It just means that they're not close enough to failing on their targets to start taking more rapid action. So this company has a 2030 target. It's only 2025. Maybe we'll start getting nervous or looking over our shoulder in 2026 or 2027. So not walking away from the commitment, but just other things have taken over the urgency in the boardroom.
Yeah, if the house is on fire, you first put out the fire and then you figure out why it was burning, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, the global house is on fire. And, and we know what to do. Ironically, the thing we've got to do is stop lighting things on fire. Stop lighting hydrocarbons on fire. And we don't have to stop, exploring for petrochemicals, hydrocarbons. Those things are amazing building products. As long as you can deal with the circular economy, 3D printing is and can be a revolution for the construction industry and powering the economy. Why are we lighting these valuable products on fire? And so it's not really the product, it's the use of the product that we need to deal
d-
with.
i- can you tell me a little bit more about that? I'm not sure I understand your point.
Well, a plastic bag or plastic materials that you're using in a 3D printer to, build a model for a car or build tools or whatever it is, they're 95% oil. And so if you use that oil to make products that are useful in the economy instead of just combusting them and releasing those CO2 into the atmosphere, you can still have an economy for all the millions of people globally that are employed in oil and gas extraction and processing. You just don't need to light that product on fire.
That makes a lot of sense. And especially when you think about, I think this is the first thing that everyone thinks about when it comes to sustainability is, well, I need to drive my car tomorrow. And the country I live in, I mean, talking about Brazil, for example, where I live in, during the summer, we have the city that I live in, there has at least 5 power outages a day because too many people are using air conditionings. It's completely unrealistic to think that everyone can use electric cars or move away from combustion engine cars. But on the other hand, we do have other solutions for that. For example, here, ethanol is pretty big. And of course, we're still lighting stuff on fire, but it it does emit less than actual gasoline. But my question to you is how feasible it is for us to expect a transition on that sort of because I feel that these industries are just so big that it's and we are we rely so much on their product that there's just very little chance of moving away from that.
Yeah, it's oversimplified to say stop lighting stuff on fire. If you think about the supply chain of an apple, getting from the tree to your house, and all of the different points along that value chain at which an internal combustion engine was required. It's almost almost all along the value chain. And so, yes, it is oversimplified to say we just need to stop lighting stuff on fire. At the same time, there are alternatives to that. And the person buying the apple can't influence, most of that or really any of that, supply chain. The only thing they can influence is the product that they chose to buy. Is one apple more sustainable than another apple because of the way it was, grown and transported to you? And so, yeah, it is difficult. But the other one that that appears on every sort of single step of the supply chain alongside the internal combustion engine is the role of banking and finance. So at every single step along that supply chain, somebody has a banker or a provider of money. And it's not just governments trying to think about how do we, drive decarbonisation across that individual supply chain. One of the ways you can do it is by incentivizing through cheaper or more expensive finance each one of those individual steps on that supply chain. How efficient was the production process? How efficient was the harvesting process? What sort of energy sources were used in the warehouse? So if you break it down to the individual steps on that supply chain, you start to identify individual solutions rather than just trying to work out how do I make this apple more sustainable or lower carbon across the entire value chain in one go.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that works hand in hand with what you said. And I think, well, I don't know, in my head, it's a good strategy to start offsetting now a lot and decrease over time because it's also, it's like what you just mentioned, it is an incentive to find more sustainable solutions because offsetting, whether you like it or not, is a cost for companies, right? And if you
It's a cost,
find
yeah. It's a low cost at the moment,
exactly.
which is why there's early mover advantage. I think there's a misconception that in for some who either oppose the use of carbon credits or feel like we should do just all direct decarbonisation immediately, there's a sort of misconception that cheap offsets are somehow bad or ineffective. Cheap doesn't necessarily mean ineffective. It means cost effective. And the reason that the carbon market exists is because of what's called the marginal cost of abatement. Something that might be difficult and expensive to achieve in one place is less difficult and less expensive to achieve in another place. And so we should take action where it is fastest and cheapest to do so first. somehow some people have got in their minds that that means that somehow, companies are dodging their obligations. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means people are acting economically rationally, and that's allowing us to deliver more climate outcomes faster. And so we absolutely should run 100 miles an hour in the direction of least cost abatement. And then when all of that, and this is how carbon markets are explicitly designed, when all of those lower cost solutions have been delivered, then solutions become more and more expensive over time. And there's a greater and greater incentive for companies to decarbonize and not have to rely on the offsets for that last mile of emissions reductions. But if you never start, you never get to that point. And so we should absolutely celebrate all companies, using carbon credits to reduce their net emissions now, even and especially if they're doing so cheaply, because that is the flywheel that gets the entire, you know, catalyst of the carbon market going. We should be leaning into, low cost emissions reductions, particularly in an inflationary environment and uncertain political environment, rather than walking away from that.
That makes perfect sense. I think you can never be pure enough for some audiences. So I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very it's a interesting parallel, but I see that happening with music a lot. If you, it's very hard to become a fan of certain kinds of music because if you don't know I don't know, you don't know the blood type of the neighbor of the bassist grandma, you're not a fan enough, and you should not be able to
Yeah.
listen to that. And it's very difficult to become, and that's why there aren't so many fans of that specific type of music. But when you come to other types of music, which is pretty much just, oh yeah, I like this, and people welcome you into that.
Yeah.
Those music genres grow
Yeah.
more and
That's a
more.
good analogy.
So if a company is doing something, of course, we cannot all be perfect and pure, but I think a company that is investing in cheap and quote unquote low quality carbon units is more likely to end up investing in good quality carbon units and decarbonizing eventually than the companies that got thrown out the door and are not doing anything
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. There's a number of reports that have been released in the past couple of years that show that companies who do use carbon credits to offset their emissions also do more decarbonisation. And I think that's counterintuitive for some people who think that using carbon credits is an excuse to not decarbonise. But actually, it makes sense when you think about it. If you're not responsible enough as a company to offset your residual emissions during a climate crisis, you're probably not responsible enough to reduce them in the first place. And so there's a correlation between those two behaviours. Your music analogy reminded me of a sort of a health analogy with pandemics and vaccines. You know, you buying carbon credits to offset your residual emissions is like being vaccinated. But it's not the only thing you have to do. You can't just be vaccinated and then, if you have COVID and then, walk around without a mask. You still got to get vaccinated. And part of the reason for being vaccinated is not just to protect you, it's to protect the broader community. So it's not just about you. And so, the carbon market analogy is rather than celebrating companies who've decided to get vaccinated, we criticize them for taking the Moderna vaccine instead of the Pfizer. And that's just demotivating for a company who did the right thing, in some cases voluntarily, just to be criticized for it, and be understandable if that company CEO or board would say, well, why bother? We're doing the right thing. We're just being criticized for it. I don't need this. I got plenty of problems I need to solve. So sure, we should encourage companies to always buy high quality carbon credits, and most carbon credits are high quality, despite what some folks would say. And so doing anything at all as part of a holistic decarbonisation strategy is laudable, and is better than doing nothing. It is ethically, reputationally, morally, and one day will become financially untenable to emit unabated CO2. The climate is already unsafe. we've already passed 1.5 degrees of warming. We're on our way quickly to 2. And if you think about the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees of warming means we have some Arctic ice in summer and some coral reefs. Above 2 degrees, we have none of either. And so it is ethically indefensible not to offset, residual carbon emissions. And criticizing companies who do that because it doesn't meet your, high bar is completely counterproductive and self-defeating for the climate.
I completely agree. But now bringing my pessimistic, cynic side back on, if we do need to take action very fast, and let's be very realistic, we need to take action as a collective. But
Mhm.
at the same time, it is very demotivating to think about the costs and and everything that involves taking action when your neighbor is not doing anything. So I think a good example of that is if every single car in my country stopped working tomorrow, China would probably emit that amount of carbon in a week or something. I don't know exactly the numbers, but it's something like that. And of course, there are reasons like we've outsourced all of the basically most of the manufacturing of the world to China, so it's kind of our scapegoat for emissions. But I don't know if I'm a lawyer and I use my car, why should I take action when a company that is mining things and burning tons of fuel a day is not
Yeah.
doing anything? Am I going to actually make a
Well,
difference?
I'm here in Australia, and many politicians here have made that same argument. Well, Australia is only, 1% of global emissions, so it doesn't matter what we do because the other 99% is out of our control. Well, sure, that's true mathematically, but how are you? And you're right, like China and the US, but in particular China, by far the largest source of global emissions, and and therefore, just on a pure, emissions, physics and chemistry perspective, as by far the biggest lever to pull in terms of reducing those emissions. That's different if you think about it per capita, of course. Um, but how do you motivate somebody in China, policymaker in China, to reduce emissions and say, you're the biggest polluter globally, you need to reduce emissions the most, if you're not prepared to do the same? So we go to China and we say, you need to reduce your emissions. And China says to us, are you reducing yours? And we say, no. Okay, well, that's the end of the conversation. Um, and it's true that, it could be kind of demotivating to be the first person or only person in your street with an electric car or solar panels or whatever. But then something interesting happens when a second person gets solar panels and a third. And so then you get this behavioral norm, particularly in sort of more collectivist societies where the behavioral norm becomes, oh, okay, this is a street in which people have solar panels. And then you start to get that snowball effect, but somebody's got to go first. We're early adopters here in our house. So we dug out our gas lines several years ago to fully electrify the house. We electrified the vehicles, electrified the house, got rid of all fossil fuels from the house. That wasn't just a little bit expensive to do. And part of the reason it was expensive is because we did it at some midlife of some appliances. The time to do it is when you need a new oven, buy an electric one instead of a fossil fuel one. But our neighbours asked us how we did it. And then other people asked us how we did it. Now there's other people doing it. So yeah, it depends on your point of view. I think getting that behavioural norm going requires someone to go first, even if that feels a bit lonely in the first instance.
I guess it goes around. It goes together with what you said at the beginning. There are companies that just made commitments because everyone was doing it and haven't found a reason to stop. It's human behavior at the core always. So What I'm hearing is that is pretty much just a cultural change that we need to develop, and that's basically the motivation, the strongest motivation that we can find today for people to take sustainable action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the S, that not only those individual actions not only can add up to a larger action overall, the behavioural norm, and that's the customer buying pattern and the customer expectations, is motivating to drive corporate action. Then you also need to go the other end and just do your best to work out how to take that decision out of people's hands. I wouldn't need to, um, upgrade my, appliances or decarbonize my household if the electricity grid or the energy grid, including gas, had been sort of redesigned and reinvested at the national or state level. Just, more climate friendly electrons would be arriving at my house without me having to do anything. So we have to do both of those things. I don't think either of them succeeds. I think that's true if you think about carbon markets overall. There's a lot of focus on tech companies and the amount of money that they're spending offsetting their emissions, and their emissions are going to grow with the explosion in AI. That's a very energy hungry sector. But we need two main cohorts of participants in carbon offsetting and carbon markets in order for the market to grow and thrive. So you do need companies like technology companies in the US, Asia, and Europe in particular, paying fairly high prices for what are fairly low emissions, in the millions of tons a year in the case of companies like Microsoft. But at the other end of the scale, you also need oil and gas companies, extractive companies, paying lower prices for much larger volumes. And they can focus on, say, avoidance credits. There's a trend in the technology sector to focus on removal credits, but we need both of those sources of demand in order for the market to scale. Some of that is consumer driven and some of it isn't. But there's macro and micro stuff, but macro stuff, you just got to work at the system level. And that's what politicians are paid to do.
Well, I mean, we rely on politicians to do that, and again, I might be pessimistic and cynical, but whenever we rely on politicians to do anything, we're kind of screwed.
Yeah.
So, what kind of hopes do we have for the systemic changes that we need to do, and what kind of steps we can take besides voting correctly?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I share your frustration. We have a election here coming up soon, where the future of climate policy will be on the ballot. Politicians are people too, you know, in the same way that we need customers to demonstrate to corporates that they want sustainable, carbon neutral, climate and nature friendly products. We have to, persuade political leaders, at least in democracies, that we want sustainable, low carbon, economies and policies. If we don't want that collectively and individually, then why would a politician acting rationally take an action that he doesn't think that, the community is asking them to deliver? You would hope that it's because they have access to information that means that they know that even if the broader community is not asking for climate action, that it is an absolute imperative for the safety and prosperity of those people. But that's not always the case. And so it's the same, I think, motivator as for corporates. Politicians have to understand that this is what their constituents demand of them. And if that's not what we're demanding of them, because we would rather have, a cheaper, carbon intensive product than say, for example, a slightly more expensive carbon free product, then, they're just following the will of the people. So in the end, that one, you've got, there's a combination of politicians being elected who know the right thing to do on behalf of their constituents in doing it, and the others who will just be much more pragmatic around, I'm just going to do what my voters elected me to do. And if that's not to take action on climate, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. But now coming back to the carbon market, you've been in this industry for a while now, and it is an industry that changed a lot and still changing quite fast, I would say. What are some things that you've noticed from when you started that have changed significantly that particularly caught your attention?
First of all, is scale. The carbon market is too small. It needs to grow by what 100 times, in the next. Well, it needs to grow by 10 times in the next 5 years, maybe by 100 times in the next 25. But it has significantly, grown. When I first worked on my first mangrove project in Kenya in 2005, the term blue carbon hadn't even been invented. And carbon market sort of barely existed then. Now it's a market in which there are thousands of active projects, thousands of projects in development, thousands of companies developing in and investing in those projects, and thousands of companies buying the credits and retiring the credits from those projects. So it has grown substantially, and the sophistication of it has grown substantially. The ability to monitor projects, digital MRV, GIS information systems, digitizing methodologies and registries, those are all really important advancements. The focus on, and by and large, the market is of high integrity and high quality, because these are rigorous processes that projects have to go through, and that these methodologies were rigorously designed. Carbon market was set up by thousands of scientists, policymakers, NGOs, and community leaders over the past 25 years. We're not making it up. It needs to be refined. It needs to be continuously improved, but it's come from a good foundation. So that's changed. Like the participation in the market at scale has changed, even though it needs to significantly grow. Obviously, the focus on integrity, has been very strong in the past couple of years. That's a good thing. And so, when we're investing, we have confidence in the market overall, in the robustness of the market. But we also know that all carbon credits aren't created equally. And so you should do some due diligence on the projects in which you're investing to make sure that they are of a high quality. I think the convergence of the compliance markets and the voluntary markets is relatively new. Putting aside, the previous usability of CDM credits in the EU, that's going to accelerate, and that is going to be good for the market overall. When we're investing in projects, we look for a range of attributes, but perhaps two core investment principles are quality and versatility. So is it a good quality project in an investable destination with a credible partner, and does it have versatile utility? Can it be used for a voluntary purpose and a compliance purpose? I think there's more focus on that than there was, even as recently as sort of 2 or 3 years ago. Prior to Glasgow, it was all about voluntary. Post Dubai, it was more about compliance. Now I think it's more about the convergence of compliance and voluntary as a holistic market solution. And I think what hopefully will continue to happen, there's too many standards and there's too few. And so, there's too few standards, for example, overseeing the issuance of nature-based avoidance credits. Vera has a monopoly on project level RED plus, the project level RED plus market. So there should be, more of that, but we don't need 20 individual standards across the carbon market overall. It's confusing, it's duplicative, and it just adds complexity to the market. I think the right number of standards, if there is one, it's somewhere between, 4 and 10. It's not 2, but it's not 50. And so I think it would be useful if some of those standards, in particular those that are already quite closely aligned in their methodologies and in their technology, if they were to consolidate, I think would be helpful for the market.
What do you believe that the carbon market is doing wrong at the moment?
Couple of things. It's doing a very poor job of articulating why it exists and why it's so important. Carbon markets are not the solution to all climate problems. They're just the solution to some problems. Accelerating climate action in a cost-effective way as a bridge to full decarbonisation. That's the role of the carbon market, and that needs to be explained well. And it needs to, and how projects get designed and delivered needs to be explained well. It's also done a poor job of, explaining the, how project developed and the integrity of projects. And also, it's an unavoidable conclusion that some projects have been of poor quality, and some of those, projects have been because of poor oversight at some of the standards, some by poor oversight at the VVB, so the auditors who are assessing the compliance and quality of projects. So we can't just say that it has been about the market has done a poor job of explaining away poor projects. There have been poor projects. They're in the minority in both number and volume, but that sort of stuff where projects haven't delivered the emissions reductions that they've claimed need to be stamped out if the market is going to scale with confidence. And I think we might have gone too far the other way now, though. With some of the new methodologies, are extremely complex, and reduce emissions reductions, accounting sort of a number of carbon credits you can generate from projects by, I don't know, in some cases 75, 80% compared to their predecessor methodologies. I think there's perhaps too much conservatism in those new methodologies, which will make them more difficult to invest in.
That makes sense. So, if the carbon market is successful in its role as a bridge to decarbonization, does that mean that inevitably the carbon market must end one day?
I hope so. I mean, our dream as investment managers in the carbon market is that all of the assets that we own go to zero because we have successfully decarbonized the economy and we no longer need, this mechanism to accelerate emissions reductions. And all we have to do is remove some residual emissions in 2050 that haven't been able to be abated otherwise. That's our dream. We would love to be out of business, but that is a couple of decades and many $1 trillion away from being a reality. So right now, what we need to do is make more action happen faster, and that's what carbon markets are for. They're not the solution to all problems. They're just the solution to some, but it is mathematically, physically, scientifically impossible to get to zero today without offsets. So we need to accept that that's the reality, and we need to invest in a high integrity way at scale, and we need to not ignore the naysayers because, criticism, constructive oversight is helpful for the market and helpful for climate action overall. And people who criticize carbon markets are well-intentioned. They want to solve the climate crisis. I think they just misunderstand how the carbon market works sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's an overall consensus that I don't know one person that doesn't like trees. Like they might not enjoy being around trees all the time because of mosquitoes and all that, especially in South Brazil. But I don't think there's one person that believes that the world should have less trees or we should pollute more. I think it's a consensus everywhere. I think it's just a matter of in the middle of the world. There's some disagreements that we need to um, you know put into perspective, and they're not, as you said, they're very constructive.
Yeah, we're not that far apart. who in the world doesn't think that women in Africa, women in particular in Africa, shouldn't have access to clean, safe cooking, or that indigenous communities in the Orinoco in Colombia shouldn't have a healthy forest, or that people in Mexico shouldn't be able to fish and be protected from hurricanes by healthy mangroves. These are all the things that carbon markets deliver, and where we have problems is when we just keep talking about the source of funds instead of the use of funds. We should be focusing at least as much on what these carbon markets are delivering, the outcomes that they're delivering, as much as we are focusing on who paid for those outcomes. There's this perception there that corporates, if they use carbon markets, they're somehow getting away with something. And at Carbon Growth Partners, we did a survey a couple of years ago, it's an online survey, 1,000 people in each of two groups. And we asked them, should companies be allowed to offset their carbon emissions? And 2/3 of people said no. Then we asked another 1,000 people, should companies be required to offset their carbon emissions? And 2/3 of people said yes.
Man, that's crazy.
It's the exact same action. The only difference is the perceived permission or permissibility of the offsetting activity, like they're getting away with something. It's not the action that people are against. It's the perceived motivation of the company taking the action. And so there's a lot we can do around reframing the language of carbon markets to motivate people to support it, I think.
That is, I'm blown away by this because it's so interesting. I did not expect that. It's really, really interesting.
One word. We changed one word in the survey, and it completely turned people's perceptions, on their
It
head.
makes a lot of sense, right? People don't like companies, and they want to, for some reason, they want to take,
People
they
don't
want to
like
punish
companies.
companies, right?
Exactly.
And that's the first thing that you learn in marketing classes. Like, people don't like companies. If you're in a good marketing class, you're not supposed to make
Yeah.
people like your company. They will never like your company because people don't like companies.
Yes. Yeah.
So we should
And
punish them.
they like some companies. If you look at it's Our World in Data, I think, or Statista publishes the list of the world's most valuable brands. Apple's in there obviously, and Google and Meta, Microsoft. 8 of the 10 world's most valuable brands, so not the world's biggest companies, but those with the highest brand value, 80% of those companies already offset their emissions, at least in part.
That's a very interesting indicator.
And so there is something about, and those companies know, almost by definition, those companies know their customers. And you might have seen that Apple was, sued for make the claim around carbon neutral Apple Watch recently. Apple's back in the market this year, retiring more carbon credits for their carbon neutral product lines. So I don't know what's going on there, but it would appear that they know their customers and know that their customers want them to do the right thing, and they're continuing to do that, notwithstanding the opposition of a small number of people who don't like it.
Definitely. Rich, we've been talking for over an hour now, and I feel that we could talk 2 hours because there are so many topics that are interesting that we can explore. Before we go, do you have any specific topics that we didn't go over that you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I think one thing that was useful for people to keep in mind, without overwhelming them, is just to don't overthink it on supply and demand and methodologies and how the carbon market is functionally operating today. Getting to net zero means reducing emissions by 50 billion tons a year, every year forever, starting now. And we are currently offsetting about 300 million tons a year. So we have to focus on how do we scale this highly effective, highly cost-effective instrument by 100 times in the next decade or so, and not get too caught up in the individual nuances of individual projects or methodologies. What we need to be working on is making it clear to all polluting companies everywhere, all countries everywhere, that carbon markets are the way in which they can accelerate their climate commitments and meet those commitments in the most cost-effective way as part of a holistic decarbonisation plan. If we can do that successfully, I think not only will the carbon market be fine, the climate will be fine too.
Amazing. Rich, thank you so much for taking the time and participating in our podcast. It was an amazing conversation and hope we can sit down and have another one in the future.
That'd be great. Thanks, Pedro. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today. The Green Earth Podcast is a DGB Group initiative. DGB is a large scale, nature based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving us a review. And if you know anyone that might benefit from this content, we'd greatly appreciate your recommendation. I'm Pedro Zimmer, your host, and I hope to see you for the next episode of the Green Earth Podcast.